Yesterday a child came out to wander, caught a dragonfly inside the jar. Fearful when the sky was full of thunder, and tearful at the falling of a star. And the seasons, they go round and round, and the painted ponies go up and down. We're captive on the carousel of time.
In the next 25 minutes, I will be talking about the relevance of neurodevelopmental trajectories in psychosis, and if that is the case, how that should or could be translated into better treatments for psychosis in the future. It's quite ambitious. First, although I will not be talking about drugs, I will not be talking about drug therapy. This is my lifetime conflicts of interest that you need to be aware of. And this is the outline of the talk. I will briefly mention on why are we not doing that well in terms of prevention in psychiatry. And we should look at outside psychiatry, outside mental health, and see what our colleagues in other areas of medicine are doing. Then I will look at psychosis as a reflection of abnormal brain development. Then I'll change gears and I will focus on shifting towards prevention and early intervention for new treatments, and then implications and priorities for the future. So let's start with the first topic. And there's a sentence, statement by Frederick Douglass, who said that it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men, that really reflects and captures most of the messages that I'm going to convey to you today. I will not be talking about most of what has been mentioned in previous talks, tertiary prevention or even secondary prevention, and I will try to focus on something that I believe has been neglected in the past, and that's primary prevention and, of course, a little bit of secondary prevention, because I do believe that prevention outweighs cure, and the amount of, in the long term, not in the short term, as you will see in future slides, but in the long term, the cost effectiveness is better for prevention than for cure. So let's look outside psychiatry. Let's open our minds and see what our colleagues are doing in cardiovascular diseases, in oncology diseases. If you look at the literature published in very high impact factor journals from our colleagues in recent decades, you will notice that the amount of papers based on primary prevention has increased dramatically. I just bring here some examples. You could take many, hundreds, thousands of them. This is about primary prevention of diabetes, with a clear message that yes, it can be done. This is about prevention in oncology. So this is data for men and women, and the red line represents the expected deaths in any given year due to tumors in the United States. The blue lane is the actual number of deaths because of tumors in the United States for men and for women. The difference is what is attributed to primary prevention. So those are the number of deaths that have been avoided because of primary prevention. And this is published by the American Oncology Society every year. So what about in psychiatry? What are we doing in terms of prevention? Well, not much. This is a recent review of the papers published or that are available in PubMed. This is prevention and diabetes, prevention and cancer, prevention and cardiovascular disease. And then on the right-hand side, you have what are we producing in terms of prevention and psychiatry or prevention and psychosis, which is the topic that I'm going to, tackle today. Despite that, there have been very recent, I should say, a number of papers by influential people saying that we are not doing enough, and this is a neglected topic. In this slide, you can, I don't think this pointer works, but anyway, it's somewhere here that this is the United States. So this is not a developing country. You know, this is, in theory, a leading country. Only 21% of all infants and toddlers are screened for developmental delays. So if you do not screen for a developmental delay, you're not going to pick it up, and then you will not be able to intervene at the time when that intervention is most likely to produce an effect. And I will again touch on this later. This is data from the UK. The slide before was from the US. This is data from the UK on the amount of money spent in research in different sections. And here you have at the very bottom the amount of research, the amount of money that it's invested in research in terms of prevention of disease and promoting well-being. Again, if you compare this to other areas of medicine, you will see that there is a huge discrepancy. So we are not doing, this is an elective topic, we're not doing what our colleagues in other areas of medicine are doing. For what reason? I mean, things in life always happen for something, right? There has to be a reason for this. Well, there are two obvious reasons I can think of. The first, it's not possible. You know, you can do primary prevention in cardiovascular disease, you can do primary prevention in oncology, but you cannot do it for mental disorders. The second one, yes, it's possible, but it's too expensive. It's not cost effectiveness, and we need to devote, the money to the people that are already sick. So because we need to take good care of them. So those are, plausible hypotheses that need to be tested. The first one is not possible. Well, I'm going to show you a lot of evidence today that it is possible, and on purpose, I chose this slide, which is 1997. To let you know that it is not now that we know that there are very cost-effective primary prevention interventions in psychiatry and mental health. We knew that back in 1997, and this is the mean effect. And this is a mean effect that you can compare to many of the drugs that we are using nowadays to treat some of the conditions. So there is good evidence out there that some interventions have a mean effect that is considerable in terms of primary, and again, primary prevention. So it is possible. Well, second, it's too expensive. This is data from the London School of Economics, data from Martin Knapp and Dave McDade, and they have calculated, in terms, this is in pounds, they have calculated what is the return, so what is the payoff of investment in primary prevention in mental health. And this is just some numbers, and you have here that for each pound that you invest in early detection of psychosis in the long term, you save 10. And this is, of course, money you save for the National Health Service, for the public health systems in the UK. For early intervention, not detection, but intervention in psychosis, for each pound, you save almost 18 pounds in the long term. But for other disorders, like prevention of conduct disorders through social and emotional learning programs, is 83 pounds. And we heard before from Professor Biggio the importance of bullying, that I will also address during my talk. For school-based interventions to reduce bullying, you save 14 pounds for each pound you invest in that. So it's possible, it's cost-effective. What is the problem? Well, one of the problems is that it is cost-effective not in the short term, but in the long term. And there are many good studies out there showing this. This is just an example. So this is an example of intervention with high-risk families in New York, and this nurse home visitation program. So these are the cost. This is the cost in the dark blue, and this is the savings, the calculated savings of the intervention. Of course, in the short term, so in the first 3 years, it's almost everything is cost. There are no savings. And so this is not that easy to sell for politicians, because when the output, the payoff, what you get back, it's in 5, 6, 10, 15 years' time. It was not because of you. It was because the one who is in power at that time. So why do I think we do it wrong? First, because we act too late, and one of the crucial concepts of what I'm going to be talking about today is therapeutic windows. And as I gave you some examples of primary prevention outside mental health, there are also many, many, many good examples out there on therapeutic windows for any given disorder. This is how important it is when you quit smoking. So it's not the same to quit smoking at the age of 25 that at the age of 45, because the risk for instance, lung cancer has nothing to do depending on how many years you have been smoking. This is, again, one more example, and I could give you many, of reperfusion therapy in myocardial infarction. So if you do it after 10 hours or 12 hours, it's not going to make any difference at all. So 10 hours or 3 days, 10 hours or 1 week doesn't make a difference. But if you do it in the first 4, 6 hours, then is when it makes a huge difference. So it's not the same to do it at 2 hours or at 3 hours, 4 hours, and then the effect vanishes with time. So there are therapeutic windows. And you can easily think of, for instance, hypothyroidism, congenital hypothyroidism. If you manage to get the thyroid hormones at a physiological level before week 3 after birth, there will be no damage. If there is someone with cretinism, with the long-term effects of hypothyroidism, and you give them, doesn't matter how much thyroid hormones at the age of 5 or 6 or 10, is not going to change anything. So the damage is done, and there will be intellectual disability. So this is an editorial by our psychiatrists from our department, very controversial and very thought-provoking, why psychogeriatrics starts right after adolescence, saying that, once you have reached the age of 16, 17, most of the damage is done. There is very little plasticity, and any intervention, any preventative intervention will have a lower effect. Because we know, in terms of brain development, there are critical periods for intervention, and this is from a graph published some years ago in Nature. And we recently published with the group of Utrecht, with Aries Sommer in Nature Schizophrenia, this paper in which we look at the different times during development, and this is age, so this will be 10, 15, 20 years of the different neurotransmitters, and how that change and plastic development of the neurotransmitter systems may correlate with some of the premorbid systems that symptoms and symptomatic domains that we see in schizophrenia. So again, it's a speculative way of looking at how some of these, again, pre-first psychotic episode symptomatic domains that you see during childhood and adolescence may reflect those neurotransmitter changes. And of course, we deal, and we touch on the therapeutic implications that this may have. Probably you are all aware of, and we were just discussing this during the break, although I noticed you don't have many breaks here, and it's a pretty enduring test, the one you have with this meeting. I was discussing during the break, the bad news that we have with phase 3 studies with Fragile X or Rett syndrome, when there was very good data with mGlu5, for instance, drugs for the treatment, and with mechanisms of action that we know are implicated in the pathophysiology, etiopathophysiciology of some of these diseases. But then phase 3 clinical trials came as negative. Well, one of the reasons may be because the animal models and phase 2 studies are done with much younger or adolescent rats and much younger patients included in phase 2 that the phase 3 studies that most of the times are done with mean ages of 30, with chronic patients that have been sick, have Rett syndrome or Fragile X for a long time. Probably changing the intellectual disability and improving the IQ at that age is not that easy as it may be much earlier during life. And this is an example from a neurodevelopmental disorder outside schizophrenia. This is autism that I believe very nicely shows the point that I want to make here. So this is one intervention, the same intervention, done by the same therapist. So the difference cannot be attributed to different intervention or different therapies, to two groups of patients with autism. A group of patients below the age of 60 months and a group of patients above the age of 60 months. So the same therapy given by the same therapies was positive and reached a positive treatment outcome in 67% of those below the age of 60 and 11% of those above the age of 60 months. So it was just the difference on how long have you been sick that made a huge and dramatic impact on the effect of the same intervention. So, you know, I think we act too late, and you know, it's mainly because it's a politician's decisions, and politicians are adults. They think they're not going to suffer from all these neurodevelopmental disorders, and the payoff is not in the next 4 years or 5 years, but in longer terms. So we had these wise men in Spain in the 17th century, Juan de Palafox y Mendoza, who said, "Kingdoms that govern with remedies rather than prevention are headed for disaster." We probably didn't listen to what he was telling us, and that's why we're where we are. And this is a picture that I took. 2 years ago, I spent 1 year sabbatical with my family in San Francisco. I was working, and I still work at the UCSF. And this is from this big park in San Francisco where I took my kids to play. And they had this sign, "No adults allowed unless accompanied by children," that I really thought was really made the point that the key here is the children, not the adults. And in terms of schizophrenia or psychosis research, most of the focus has always been in the adult psychiatry, when we know now that these are neurodevelopmental disorders. So, in theory, if this is a neurodevelopmental disorder and we talk about prevention, we need to look much earlier than we have done in the past. Psychotic symptoms as reflection of a normal developmental trajectories. Well, we know that by the time there is a first psychotic episode, there have been many times, many different signs throughout development, starting at infancy, 3-12 months. There are problems with neuromotor, minor soft neurological signs, speech, language, social-emotional behavior. How do you relate with peers in kindergarten, in primary school, cognition, that may identify very unspecifically a group of kids that may be a higher risk to develop psychosis later in life. So the question is, can we really try to come up with interventions that specifically try to reduce the incidence of psychosis? My answer will be no. No, there will be no single intervention at the primary prevention level that will be specific to psychosis. That could be the case if this was true. And that could be the case if there were silos of risk factors for anxiety, depression, or schizophrenia that will be independent one from each other. Then we could come up with interventions that specifically target one of these disorders. But I do believe that that is not the case. And the case is that, as Professor Pat McGorry has stated, that there is some pluripotentiality here in the middle. And you end up having one disorder or the other based on the combination of those biological risk factors and exposure to environmental factors. Where is the evidence to support this second approach rather than the first? Well, of course, genetic studies showing shared risk factors for all neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism, including schizophrenia, bipolar disorders. Second is that if you study, and we have a large cohort of offsprings of patients both with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and if you study the offsprings of people with severe mental disorders, the incidence of any given DSM-5 disorder will be higher. So it's not only schizophrenia, offsprings of people with schizophrenia are at a higher risk to develop schizophrenia. So it's not, there's not that clear picture. Then, many of these risk factors are completely unspecific. So if you have a low IQ, or a very high one, but mostly if you have a low IQ, you're at risk to develop psychosis and any other mental disorder. And here you have bipolar disorder, severe depression. Psychotic symptoms in childhood are a marker of general vulnerability, not only to psychosis, schizophrenia, but also to complete suicide, or to have abuse disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. So psychotic symptoms in childhood, and specifically predict mental disorders in later on in life. And when we look backwards in patients with that already are diagnosed with schizophrenia, so the risk of schizophrenia increases after all child and adolescent psychiatric disorders. So you have, eating disorders, affective disorders, ADHD, all those disorders increase the risk of future schizophrenia. So then we could think, well, so what's the story with that high-risk subjects, prodromal subjects that are included in all these Naples study and the studies that we are conducted here in Europe? Are those people at higher risk to develop schizophrenia and psychosis? Yes, but the truth is that only 1/3 end up having psychosis or schizophrenia. What happens with the other 2/3? Well, the other 2/3, 90% of them will end up having any other mental disorders. So these are not only people at higher risk of schizophrenia. These are people at very, very high risk to develop a mental disorder. And this is something that we have been working on, the different neurodevelopmental trajectories in people that end up having schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or other neurodevelopmental disorders, and this was published in Schizophrenia Bulletin a couple of years ago. So if this is a trajectory of schizophrenia, and we have learned that this is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and we're acting here, we're missing the point. And the point is that, yes, we need to help these people, but if we really want to do primary or, in some cases, secondary prevention, and try to avoid the risk of psychosis by having people to have less severe disorders, and that will, in a way, be called secondary prevention, we have to act much earlier. Because we know that some of the brain changes that you see in first episode psychosis were there before. We see those brain changes, and this is the data from our group, in the offsprings of people with persons with schizophrenia and bipolar disorders much earlier, much before that they have their first psychotic episode. And again, they have abnormalities in neurodevelopmental disorders, and here we show premorbid impairment during school in those who 15, 20 years later develop schizophrenia or bipolar disorders. So I do believe that there is a need to shift the focus toward prevention and early intervention in developmentally sensitive periods. So again, the therapeutic window notion. I will go now quite fast just to show you that during different stages of development, there are different risk factors. And I will show you just examples of the risk factors for which, some of them, for which there are preventative interventions that have shown to be efficacious. So I will go different stages. I will give you one or two examples of risk factors for psychosis, and I'll give you the evidence that that risk factor can be diminished by different interventions. One is maternal stress and delayed parenthood. Not only maternal. This was very recently published a few months ago in Science, showing in an animal model that when the parents are stressed, there are abnormalities in the offsprings in the first and second generation. So it's not only maternal stress, but it seems to be also paternal stress at the time of conception. Parental age is a clear risk factor, mostly for fathers above the age of 50. Family income, parental education. So you may say, well, there is nothing you can do about that. Well, there have been studies. There's one study, very elegant, published in JAMA some years ago, that was conducted in Mexico, in which families were given money to try to implement some of these primary preventative interventions. And then they measured the outcome in terms of IQ of those kids, or school performance, or neurocognitive assessments. And they saw that the families that invested that little money in those primary preventative interventions had a much better outcome, and the money that was invested was much less than the money spent otherwise in social welfare and many of the expenses that you have with lower IQ and intellectual disability. Because there are, clear messages out there that childhood poverty correlates with neurocognitive development. And this is a study that I mentioned to you before. It was published in Lancet 2018, Role of Cash in Conditional Cash Transfer, an analysis of Mexico opportunities. So, very interesting study in how this little money can be invested in better outcomes. Pregnancy. Substance use during pregnancy and risk of psychosis, again, clear relationship, and these are all preventative measures. Number of cigarettes, vitamin D supplementation, again, very good data from cohort studies in Finland. Birth and perinatal period, obstetric complications and psychosis. This is a study from our group. Risk of psychosis in preterm children. Nowadays, we manage to get kids with weights of 600 grams, 27 weeks. They all, or many of them survive when that was impossible before, but they survive at a price. And almost 70–80% of those kids with very, very, very low weight at birth will experience developmental problems, ADHD and intellectual disability, and psychosis in the long term. There is a subgroup of people that are even higher risk, and that's mothers with, moms with schizophrenia, severe mental disorders that give birth to children. So there may be interaction between some of these risk factors. Preschool age, this is the effect of neglect on brain development. This is a CT scan on a normal 3-year-old children and a 3-year-old children that has been chronically and intensively abused. Again, there are effective preventative interventions in preschool age children. This is data from the High Perry Preschool study of kids that had intervention during school 40 years later. And 40 years later, the ones that had the intervention were less likely to be arrested. They have a better graduate. They earn more money. They have more. They have higher IQ, above 90, in a larger percentage of cases, 67, as compared to 28. So of course, IQ is genetically mediated. But some of these studies show you that it's not only genetically mediated, and you can do things to improve it. Primary school, again, we heard from Professor Biggio this morning, the role of bullying. And this is the risk of psychotic symptoms at age 12. When there is an accident, when there is bullying, when there is maltreatment, and when there is both bullying and maltreatment. So it's a 5 times higher risk when there is a combination of bullying and maltreatment than as compared to healthy people that has not suffered bullying. And this is a very interesting study. You know that hallucinations are present in around 6–8% of normal kids. So this is the blue line here. This is what if you take kids at the age of 8–10 years of age, you will see this prevalence of hallucinations. When these kids have been abused, this is the rate of auditory hallucinations. It goes up to 20–25%. If you stop the physical abuse and you measure later, and this is for physical abuse, this is for bullying, you see the same, more or less the same results. When the physical abuse stops early enough, the prevalence of auditory hallucinations go back to normal levels. So again, this is telling you that many of these can be preventable, and the prevention has very fundamental effects in how these children experience some of these psychotic symptoms. Adolescents, cannabis is a good example of a drug that reduces the age of onset, and there are also many good studies out there on primary prevention of cannabis use and how cost-effectiveness it may be. There are also very good animal models of drugs that can be used during adolescence. This is data from Tony Grace showing that diazepam reduces the dopamine system hyperresponsivity in this animal model, the MAM model. There are also some examples out there on how NAC, N-acetylcysteine, which is the precursor of glutathione, in animal models of schizophrenia, diminish or actually completely stops some of the phenotypes that you see in these rats that resemble schizophrenia. And that NAC can also be given not only very early in childhood, but also during adolescence. So I will finish with implications and priorities for the future. This is the roadmap for mental health research in Europe that the Mental Health Network in Spain had the privilege to coordinate. And the #1 high-level priority identified was research into mental health disorder prevention, health promotion, and intervention in children, adolescents, and young people. And I foresee that in Horizon 2020, from here until year 2020, the EU will be investing and having a lot of topics on this area. And again, there are many papers out there. This is from Lancet 2015, highlighting that prevention and very early intervention is necessary from a net developmental perspective. So we need to increase awareness. We need to focus on children that are at high risk or very high risk, those neglected, those bullied, and of course, those who are offsprings of people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Also, those, and this is from a paper we published last year, we have a 22q11 clinic in my hospital, and you should know that around 50% of people with 22q11 have psychotic symptoms, and around 20–25% end up having schizophrenia. So that's a real target group of kids in which we can implement many of these interventions that, by the way, have shown to be efficacious in order to reduce either the incidence of a mental disorder or at least the incidence of a severe mental disorder. Support and parenting in mothers with schizophrenia, and there is effective interventions, and there was a meta-analysis published some years ago in the Journal of American Academy of Journalists and Psychiatry. And just to summarize and wrap up what I said, some of these risk factors are not present during the whole development, and the interventions have to be targeted and have to be tailored for those therapeutic window. And this summarizes what I have just said. So I wrote this editorial some years ago saying someone is not listening to the facts. There is little psychiatry outside journalism and psychiatry. If I will have to write this same editorial again, I will write there is little psychiatry outside preventative psychiatry. So in conclusion, there is still little interest in preventative interventions in psychiatry as compared to other medical specialties. Behavioral symptoms, delusions, hallucinations, and so on, are late manifestations of the underlying brain process, and recent knowledge about developmental risk for psychosis has shaped a promising outlook for early intervention, and that should shed light on future interventions for many of these conditions. Risk factors do not seem to be disorder-specific, so I don't believe we will have psychosis-specific primary prevention interventions. And the priority for next years will be focused towards very early interventions in which the aim is not prevention of psychosis. Eventually, specific interventions in developmentally sensitive periods that may reduce the incidence of psychosis or shift evolution towards less severe presentations. And we clearly need, from right now, to start working and have a specific and special clinics or outpatient programs for those who are at very high risk. And I do believe that if we follow that advice, there is a better future for all of us in the future.
And the seasons, they go round and round, and the painted bodies go up and down. We're captive on the carriage